Welcome to my talk. We're going to be talking about improving developer experience and, of course, using Databricks, Delta, and dbt Cloud. My name's Chris, and I've done a couple different things in data. So started more data science. Now I'm doing more data engineering at Udemy. And my beige flag is that I say data instead of data. So sorry about that. Udemy is a great company. Our mission is to improve lives through learning. And we're doing that at a pretty cool scale. So the consumer side is really big, of course, but we're also selling to businesses now. It's a global business. So really cool stuff there. Just to go over what we'll cover in this talk, I'll just start out with who I think this talk is best suited for. And then we'll go to what we were doing ELT-wise at Udemy before dbt. And then sort of challenges that I saw along the way. And then we'll get more into the strategy and tactical stuff around using dbt Cloud, Delta, et cetera. So for this talk, hopefully you're at least somewhat familiar with modern data stack. You're a user of dbt to some degree and at least have a few years experience in the data industry. On that, I think you're probably pretty good. And our goals are really going to be to elaborate on getting dbt Cloud to 5 to 75 people in an organization. So we want to include really solid development practices, so enabling you to get a project up to a couple thousand models cleanly. That's our goal here. And we're not really going to do a ton with either unproven experimental technologies. We're going to try to be pretty vanilla in that regard. And so if you're really new to dbt Cloud, hopefully you got some strategic guidance here. If you're already using it, hopefully there's some optimizations that are cool for y'all. And really, we just want to get as much value as we can out of managed services. They're expensive, right? So that's what we're aiming for. So as far as ELT at Udemy, I joined about 1.5 years ago. And I'll sort of talk about what it was like developing first. So as far as developer environments, we were using local IDs. We had a shared remote environment as well that everyone in our data org would use, and we're doing a lot of manual execution. So we're using Airflow and deploying that locally or through this remote environment as well. And then on the prod side, we self-host an Airflow instance that's shared across organization. So lots of high-volume stuff going there through S3 and Redshift. And we have a variety of different execution engines, a lot of SQL-like stuff, and Python and Scala as well. So if I had to think about sort of how organizations traditionally manage ETL, you sort of have this end-to-end approach, which I think is more conventional, more classic, where you might have a single team, a single person maybe, owning the entire end-to-end process. And of course, in more modern formations, you have more component-based ownership, so you're breaking down, you're specializing. So extraction loading might be owned by a separate team. In transformation, you might have a bunch of different experts who are doing different types of modeling there. And as far as Udemy, I would say we're on that path, definitely getting closer to being fully component-based. That pairs nicely with our data organization. So we're pretty big, over 90 folks. We have a bunch of different specializations. So we have a data science function, data eng, which I'm on, a data platform, a products team, and a services team. And so it's pretty lightweight from the top. So most people are ICs, and they have a bunch of seniority from a variety of industries. So a lot of different expectations coming into what feels natural for developers. And we have a lot of cross-cutting ownership depending on what data assets you're working with. So I tried to lay that out a little bit here. Data platform's sort of core to a lot of things, so they self-host and manage a lot of things for us, and they do a little bit of ingestion, but as you can see, a lot of the other functions are also doing a lot of other things. So I think this actually pairs pretty well with that idea from the previous slide about getting closer to component-based ownership. I think the only challenge there is that our legacy historical stack is kind of messy, and so that's been slowing us down a bit as far as the developer experience goes. And also, I think an end goal really should be, how do we get the most out of our data experts, which we have so many? How do we increase the velocity, just get more value out of our team? So if I had to think about, this is sort of where we started out batch architecture-wise, especially when I was there. So we had a couple different orchestration engines, a lot of different file formats, multiple storage solutions for various environments, a lot of different compute engines as well. We are also building an in-house metrics platform, so a lot going on, and particularly paired with the data org as a whole, just a lot of different cross-cutting approaches to development, to pipeline building, et cetera. So coming in, the solution to us felt relatively transparent of just how do we simplify a lot of that, right? So especially, that's where this talk comes in, is Delta Lake, Databricks, and of course introducing dbt, and Airflow still plays a part in this, but that seemed like a clean goal to get to. Of course, the problem is a bunch of organizational challenges, et cetera. So getting into a new organization, I'm sure a lot of people feel this way. you see so much stuff that you feel like you can improve on. So one of the things I learned was I felt like there was a series of challenges, and I bucketed those into a couple different types. The first type I thought was that because we were like an Airflow shop, really, Airflow scales a lot differently than DBT, and I thought that was relatively unintuitive to a lot of the different developers we had across our verticals, and so just providing better education and clarity around that. We're also seeing just a huge amount of table growth. So across all of our functions, that's just a global problem in production. It's also unclear what should development environments look like. So a lot of differentiation across functions, even down to the individual. And then there's also a question of just how we're productionizing jobs. Pretty massive Airflow instance, so that can get tricky there too. So of course, solution is going to be DBT oriented, and we're going to use Delta Lake to help us with that. I'll start more strategic and then go a little bit more tactical. So as far as doing more education around how I think Airflow really differentiates from DBT, I think Airflow at its core, and maybe this is review for folks, but it's really good at helping you construct a lot of DAGs, and that's basically its scaling vector, whereas DBT is really focused on a single DAG. And I know there's like multi-project instances, but even in those, you're still trying to get as many nodes. That's really your main scaling vector, is getting a ton of nodes into your DAG, and that's really the philosophies that differentiate the two. There's different pros and cons, I think, that come with that, right? So on the Airflow side, if you're a functional shop using functional programming paradigms, you can maybe leverage a lot that way. There's also, of course, a really rich tooling and operator ecosystem if you're doing things inside of individual DAGs. I would say that the tooling outside of DAGs or between DAGs is a little bit weaker there. And then on the DBT side, I think there's so much value, again, at the node level. So relationships between different nodes. At its core, I think DBT is a much more data-aware tool than Airflow is natively. So the strategy that follows from that I thought was pretty intuitive. I think DBT's biggest strength is definitely the flexibility of its CLI, right? So potentially very obvious, but the nth table that you're building into DBT, really easy to integrate, really easy to spin up. You're using existing infrastructure, you're leveraging all the relationships you've already defined in place. Airflow is really cool when it comes to tasks, right? There's so much you can do with it, but at the end of the day, you're talking about a lot of customization. Potentially, you're building automation on top of Airflow as well. And then there's also considerations around overhead and infrastructure for individual tasks, DAGs, et cetera. So you can think about all that for a team that, let's say you're DS or ML, like this is not necessarily your core focus, right? And so for them, it's a frictional experience. The other problem, I hope we can see this, is a lot of table growth. So this is just one DAG that I pulled out. But as you can see, this becomes a problem even just to semantically sort of reason about. Unfortunately, it wasn't necessarily rare to see things like that. So we have over 700 Airflow DAGs in production to give you an idea of where we're at scale-wise. Ownership, especially when you see DAGs like that, is often unclear just because, again, we have so many different data practitioners working on similar and shared assets. And also the availability of the data working across different storage engines for different purposes can be tricky, as well as when you're defining things in different like SQL-like logic, for example. And something I just noticed, which is kind of an incentive that was built into this, was that it was becoming easier to build new tables, adding more to sort of the table growth than it was to use existing stuff in our stack, because basically just the startup cost of trying to understand everything that's going on wasn't worth it for a lot of data folks, and I can't really blame them. So the simple solution really for us was just how do we increase reusability? At the end of the day, it's relatively straightforward. So from the modeling perspective, introduce data modeling. A lot of people have covered that. We use like a modified Kimball approach. So this is sort of what that looks like. I include a little bit more detail on the edges, but basically pretty standard setup up to the marks. And then we've added this like extended layer. And what we use that for is this MISI file structure. So that just stands for mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. And the idea there is just every subteam can have a directory, which of course in DBT means you own a schema. And it means that you can't necessarily work in these other folders. And so that defines ownership a little bit more cleanly and allows a variety of different practitioners to work together. Of course, this is all backed by Lakehouse. We're using Unity Catalog and Databricks, as mentioned. And the idea here is to support whether you're DE, DS, ML. So depending on your function, you might be spending more or less time moving in and out of these tools or using other tools as well. But the idea was to have a relatively simple experience regardless. So that's what we're going to get into next, is thinking about this developer lifecycle. So if I had to think about the dev environment, basically our decision ended up being we wanted to go remote first. So main reason being easy for us to do governance around, easy for users to get onboarded. But there's really two components around that, and think of dev environment and CI honestly very similarly. So the first, of course, is going to be around the DBT Cloud ID. So really simply, we can manage our SSO cleanly. Databricks, DBT, GitHub, those really come together pretty easily. I think the most valuable piece for us, though, for sure, was being able to vertically integrate the experience. So especially compared to our legacy stack, you can code, you can query, you can do analysis, you can do exploration, you can open up a PR really fast, you can look at your dependencies, you can inherit tests from teams that have very different exposure to you, to different pipelines. All that stuff was just super valuable to us. And then, of course, we get additional functionality, which is great, right? So things like SQL Fluff, the Python and YAML linting, for example. And we're layering on other technologies behind the scenes. So we have Protocera, for example, for doing permissioning. Of course, there's potentially downsides to going all in on the Cloud ID, but we were sort of aware that support was coming, and there's been great talks about what DBT is doing there. So with the DBT Cloud CLI, et cetera, we think this is actually just the beginning, and we can begin to support other modes of interacting with our environment, but just a really great way to start out. The second component I'm going to talk about is relatively straightforward GitHub integration. So everybody knows CLI. I hope the Slim CLI features are great. I think specifically we really like DBT Project Evaluator, and that really emphasizes everything we're doing with the modified Kimball approach. So automates a ton of stuff there. I think there's a few gotchas that I'm going to call out with Slim CI that for us were creating a little bit of friction, but once you get these out of the way, we haven't really had any problems with our Slim CI, and it's been really effective. So the first is I would really recommend specifying as a step, running all your singular tests together. The dependencies in your DAG can be kind of tricky, so getting that isolated is important. And then also excluding relationship tests, because when you're using modified, those are often not inherited as intuitively as you would expect. And also excluding certain packages that are maybe more administrative, depending on your use case you may or may not want to use. Second thing we looked at is, of course, with GitHub, you get great stuff like code owners, so that pairs really well with our Kimball ideas and the DBT project YAML, but also really leveraging the automated suggestions that you can get out of GitHub. So those have been super cool for us, especially with SQL Fluff Actions. We've used that a bunch. So directly in the PR, you can get these automated suggestions. You can batch them into a single commit. And we're running both lint and fixed modes. So it's surfacing a bunch of things. So again, we don't have to pull developers outside of this really straightforward remote experience. And we're doing the same thing on the YAML side. We're not using prettier at this point, but we're doing things around file naming and the file contents themselves as well. So that brings us to configuring production. So what I want to start out with is basically thinking about a default configuration for all of our jobs. So regardless of what we're doing from this moment forward, it's all going to be buttressed on the following. So the first thing is fresh and defer. That's what I'm calling it for now. But basically, there's three components to this. So the first component is source freshness. So it's adding that loaded at field to your YAMLs. And what that's doing is it's setting a predictable cadence for when your source data is arriving that DBT can know about. So that's the first step you need. The second step you need is the source freshness checks, which are going to look at if there are new transactions coming to your sources. And the third is going to be around deferring to a production environment. So there's been a couple other talks I know this week talking a little bit about that. Those three in conjunction give you a really powerful default configuration. So the way that's going to look like here is first, you're just going to look for this run source freshness. Sometimes you're going to have sources that don't have a clear loaded at field. So you can provide a dummy block if you need, just calling like a current timestamp, and you'll be able to fulfill that. For fresh rebuilds, this is a really important command for us. So the source status fresher plus, this is really killer because it lets you, by using this in all of our jobs in each of our commands, it lets us both check that data is not stale and that there's new transactions to process. Without meeting both of those conditions, we're not going to materialize anything in our jobs. So what that looks like is you're going to skip all the nodes that don't meet those criteria. And so that means that we can layer on a lot of jobs across our nodes in the same DAG, and we can still be relatively compute efficient. And that's also, of course, enabled by deferring to the prod environment. So here's a couple of screenshots about exactly what that might look like. We can circle back on this later if y'all would like. I think I have something a little bigger in the appendix as well. But this is super powerful just to like as a base configuration. Of course, lastly, we have admin types of packages that give us great metadata. So again, project evaluators coming over that so we know what's happening with our jobs after the fact. We're using artifacts. We might think about elementary things like that. And lastly, we apply analyst permissions across all of our devs by default. So that means they can introspect into what's going on job-wise, but they're not going to be able to make any modifications. And the reason for that is this is a little bit finicky, so we need this to be reliable. They can still see what's going on. They just have to consult myself or my team to set up additional changes or configure anything differently. So thinking about, let's say you're trying to bring nodes to production, how do we think about that in this model? So basically we have a default cadence. So all nodes will go through this by default. The first purpose is going to be around general analytics. So we notice that vast majority of our time for us, a once daily schedule is going to be sufficient. And so that's where we're going to start out. So really simple. Other people have talked about this a lot. So a daily DAG and a weekly full refresh. You can even do less if you feel like you don't need it. And of course, we don't need to do much infrastructure or orchestration around this, and it's very compute efficient because we can leverage the threading across all of our nodes, which is great. Of course, that's not going to be sufficient all the time, right? So let's say you have a more urgent SLA. Could be you're trying to invoke just tests, or maybe you want to notify stakeholders, something like that. So now we're going to start layering on additional jobs in the same project. And we can do this, so maybe we're doing it hourly, maybe every few hours. And because of the configuration I mentioned in the previous slide, we have devs come to the admins to create these jobs. So it creates a little bit of a bottleneck, but we find that that's worth the trade-off. It's not too hard for us to configure in the first place, but it also helps us from getting into a place where we just have tons and tons of jobs running. On that side, actually, we think that because of the configuration described in the previous slide, we get enough efficiency that we're not too worried about adding a lot of jobs. So we picture comfortably running several to dozens of jobs. More than that is probably not appropriate for a single project, but that's sort of how we're balancing these things. And then finally, this is really exceptional cases, so not, I would say DBT is not yet purpose-built for these sorts of things, but if you have a really urgent SLA for some reason, so something comparable to an Airflow trigger, what you can do is you can have a long-run daily job. You can kick it off every day, and we're doing like a mock polling feature. So we're just writing while loops into Python models, and then you can pull source data. You can conditionally invoke after that, and that's how we're sort of mimicking that quicker SLA. Of course, this can go haywire really fast. So, admin's got to review this, and we're fine doing that. We're also trying to give guidance around like, is DBT the right tool for this use case, right? So in certain cases it can be, but that's a big reason why we're also holding on to Airflow. So if I had to think about what our future roadmap is going to be, we definitely want to double down on a lot of stuff I've already described. First of all, of course, just scaling it up, so more users, more content, more assets that are going to be powered by this model. We really like the direction of the CI/CD so far, so one thing we're excited about is using DBT clones. So one of the downfalls with Listlum CI right now is incremental models will full refresh, which is potentially really expensive. So that's a really cool feature we're excited about. There's a few other things that we're adding in there that we think can also give us cool functionality. And then on the DBT side, I know they've released DBT retry. That's super exciting. So being able to restart failed jobs, super intuitive. Getting that out of the cloud experience as well, that's excellent. There's also this package, DBT jobs as code, so it's more YAML definition of jobs. So that's just to provide better governance, versioning, all that stuff. So that's something we're kind of excited about. There's a few other things there that we're exploring as well, but that covers the more important things. So in summary, if we had to think, okay, how do we really improve our developer experience, right? So I think the first thing is just being really clear on how high value the DBT CLI is. So I think it's extremely high leverage. It's really valuable for a modern data stack. And so I think for a lot of projects that I see, it's not for everyone, but I feel like a lot of projects can scale up the number of nodes really comfortably. And so I see a lot of people worrying about scaling out when they're into the hundreds of nodes. And I think you can comfortably comfortably stay in the same project if you're there. There's, of course, exceptions to that. Everyone has to figure that out for themselves, but that's the first thing, and you get a lot more leverage inside of a single project. There's great features moving to multi-project, and we're excited about that too, but I think at its core, we're just seeing so much value of the nodes inside of a single project. Second of all, really simple. Modified Kimball, we think that's a super useful approach, and data modeling's here to stay, I'm afraid. So with our extended layer, we can work with our cross-functional data partners. The unified software developer lifecycle, so being remote first is a big contrast from what we're currently doing in the rest of our stack, and we hope to use that as sort of a magnet to pull in more developers for us. And lastly, having a really simple production configuration. So just by prioritizing and classifying our jobs like this, we think we can actually do quite a bit with a relatively simple, just powerful strategy. And it really all is defined by how powerful DBT can be. So with that, I just want to thank the folks at Udemy on the data team, as well as the DBT folks and the community. I've learned a ton from this community. So feel free to connect with me if you have any questions. And we have a little bit of time here, so I'm happy to take questions and answers. I can pass around a mic if y'all are interested. No? Yep. I can take your question. I'll just repeat it.
All right, cool. Yeah, I guess my question with your setup, you're using DBT on Databricks.
Right.
Do you use any of the Python models on this, and how much of your compute do you drive outside of DBT with this vanilla Databricks jobs? I'm curious how you have that set up.
Right. Yeah, so we have a lot of stuff that's, we had a lot of SQL-like stuff, so all that was like easy candidates for DBT. We do have some batch Python stuff. We're not doing much Pythonically in this instance, aside from like the exceptional cases I outlined. We're happy to consider that, but just because we have Airflow, we feel like let's just use the right tool for the right scenario. Yeah, and then we also have like streaming cases and stuff like that. So there's actually a couple interesting talks I've seen this week that sort of talk about going into Python models, but I'm a little bit more cautious and just trying to let the community prove out stuff, and then I'll wade into it. Yeah.
Don't forget to repeat the question.
Oh, sorry about that. The question was about, are we thinking about using Python or Python models in this configuration? Sorry about that. Yep.
This may be part of it. I was just curious, so you're using Airflow for orchestration. Are you also using Databricks like workflow as well in your, as you're going from raw staging to intermediate and art and marks?
Right. So the question is, are we using Databricks to,
Their workflow.
trying to get back here,
Job workflow.
are we using the workflow from Databricks to manage the layered process that I highlighted earlier on? I'm struggling a little bit with the, sorry about this. I guess I'll try to talk and do this at the same time.
Really far away.
I know, it really is. Yeah, so I guess the main thing is we're not really. So we're using Airflow for, just for legacy reasons, we have a lot of our Python batch stuff there, and we're mostly trying to do everything through DBT Cloud. So other than authentication, anything that's like like managing users and that sort of thing, we like using Databricks. But other than that, we're trying to keep it all agnostic as far as DBT is concerned, because we have a data platform team, and they're doing a lot with Databricks, so they're upgrading us into Unity Catalog and a lot of other things. So we don't want to step on their toes. So that's sort of what I think is. Yeah. Any other questions? I may even make it back to that slide. Oh, exciting. There we go. All right. Cool. Oh, right here.
So you mentioned Delta in the title of this talk. Can you talk a bit more about why specifically Databricks and Delta contribute to the success you've had in improving developer experience?
Right. So the question is why specifically Delta and Databricks contributed to our experience. So I think the main reason has to do with organization. So this is actually a good slide for it, but we have a lot of different practitioners. A lot of those teams are operating at pretty significant scale. So the main reason is just we have folks who need to be operating on the lake. And so this sort of brings everyone together so we can have our DS folks still pulled into whatever workflows they need as well as ML, but also our DE stuff and anything that we're doing analyst-wise, batch-wise, it can just all be in the same place. So pretty simple answer, but it works super well for us. The other reason is we get a lot of leverage out of the Unity catalog features. So anything that our data platform team brings there, anything that we're ingesting into our lake, we get quick access to that. Some of the Unity catalog stuff that we're excited about is stuff like I can't remember the feature, it's like moving back in history, any additional cataloging we want to do on top of that. So all this is we use Data Hub, but if you have another catalog provider like Atlan or something like that. So it's really the simplicity of the experience. Historically too, for us, we had a bunch of different, if you remember that stack slide, we're in so many different storage and compute environments. So simplicity and unification was really big here. Another question?
I'm assuming raw is being brought in as raw, so I'm assuming it's a different
Right.
format, and the staging is just Databricks autoloader, or?
Right, so the raw here, it has to be in Delta. So if you're using the Databricks DBT connector, you want to make sure it's in Delta. There is bugginess if you're using that connector with Parquet, which we're using. So specifically, we see with snapshots, snapshots aren't read as well. You have to run them a couple times. It'll eventually work, but those can be pretty buggy, especially when the snapshot has any schema changes. So you want to try to have the raw in Delta if you can. So that's part of the thinking.
You're importing it or placing it into your data lake already as a Delta format?
Right, so the question is, are we already placing our data in Delta when it comes into the lake? And that's right. So we're upgrading a lot of different processes to write into our lake as Delta. So that includes our eventing, that includes like anything that's kind of like read replicas, all that stuff, we want that formatted in Delta. And then that again, it just powers unification. So this is just our batch stuff, right? So for streaming, for other workflows that ML might be doing, they can configure their own workflows, but it still sort of works all the same. Yeah. Cool. I'll be here for a few more minutes, so if anyone has questions, I can talk, and yeah, let me know. Thanks for coming, though.